I've told this story maybe 40 times now, and every time I get to the part about the water, somebody in the room goes quiet. So I'll warn you ahead of time. The water part is where it turns. My name's Toma Vresik. I was a floor steward on the Skyhold at Vor, which is a fancy way of saying I carried trays and stood against walls and made myself look like furniture. 14 years of it. I have a bad hip and a memory that won't let go of things, and those two facts are basically my whole biography. But I was in the Blue Hall the day the Queen chose the human. I was 6 meters away, close enough that when the court gasped, I felt it move the air. Let me back up. The Skyhold. You've probably seen pictures of Vor. Everybody's seen pictures. That great white tooth of a mountain with the palace grown out of the top of it like frost on a window. All those spires that curve inward instead of out. So from a distance it looks like a hand half closed around something precious. Pictures don't tell you it's cold. Not the pretty kind of cold. The kind that finds the gaps in your sleeves. Pictures don't tell you the sound either. The Skyhold hums. There's a resonance lattice under the whole structure, old tech, older than the current dynasty, and nobody's entirely sure how it works anymore. It keeps the towers from snapping in the wind. It also makes a low note, right at the bottom edge of what a Kaleri can hear, and after a few years of living there, you stop noticing it. Then you go down to the lowlands on leave and the silence keeps you awake for a week. I'm Kaleri, by the way, in case that matters to you. We're tall, we're gray-skinned, we've got the ridge down the spine and the second eyelid that most species find unsettling. We're not the biggest species in the conquered and we're not the smartest, but we've been in space for 11,000 years and we're tidy about it. And in a galaxy full of upstarts, longevity buys you a seat at good tables. The dynasty in my time was House Venalitra. Queen Solving II sat the Aurelian chair. Her daughter, the reason for this whole story, was Princess Ilving, 7 standard years old, and the sole surviving heir after the Gray Season. Nobody talks about the Gray Season. I'll talk about it, because you need to understand it or nothing else makes sense. 9 years before this story, a hemorrhagic prion swept the northern provinces. It didn't kill the poor. That's the part people get wrong when they tell it. It killed the nobility, because the nobility all took the same ritual immersion in the same 3 ancestral springs, and one of those springs had gone bad. 206 members of the extended royal line died in 11 weeks. The queen lost her mother, her brother, her first 2 children, and her consort. She didn't lose her mind. That's what people said about her with real awe. She didn't lose her mind. She buried them, she reorganized the succession, she executed the spring warden who'd falsified the purity readings, and she went back to work. But something in her had gone hard and strange, and everybody could feel it, especially about Ilving. That child was the last thread of a 1,000-year weave, and the queen guarded her like a woman guarding a candle in a storm. Which is why what happened in the Blue Hall was so completely, catastrophically insane. Let me set the scene properly, because the setup is half of it. Every 7 years the conquered holds a recognition. It's not a summit. Nobody negotiates anything. It's ceremonial, a parade of species and delegations who come to the seat of whichever house holds the rotating custodianship, and they present themselves, and they're formally seen. It's basically a very long line. But there's an old rule buried in it. Ancient rule from back when the conquered was 6 species and a handshake. Any delegation that presents itself may petition the host for companion standing, the right to place one of their own in the household of the host as a resident guest. It's a hostage system. Everybody knows it's a hostage system. It's a polite hostage system, and nobody's actually used it in about 400 years because it's mortifying for everyone involved. Petitions get made because tradition demands it, and they get declined with a nice speech, and everyone moves on to the wine. That was the schedule. Presentations, petitions, declines, wine. Humans were on the list that year. It was their first recognition. They'd been admitted to observer status 8 years before. I remember the arguments, and there was a lot of noise about them in the servants' corridors. Because the humans were strange. The noise about humans. Here's what we knew, or thought we knew. They came from a heavy world. Not death world heavy, not in the technical classification, but on the high side of the survivable band, and it showed. Their bones were dense. Their tendons were absurd. There were reports out of the Vec border incidents. This was maybe 5 years old at the time, of a human security contractor who'd been shot 4 times through the torso and had kept walking for 11 minutes. 11 minutes. A Kaleri stops in 11 seconds, politely. They didn't have any particular technology worth stealing. Their ships were ugly and cheap. Their computing was second tier. What they had was stamina, and a completely deranged approach to risk that no xenopsychologist had managed to explain. The Threshkin ambassador, you'll meet him later, he's important, had said something at a symposium that got repeated everywhere. He said, every other species in the conquered evolved to escape danger. Humanity evolved to follow it home. That got laughs. It also got repeated a lot in the years after, and less as a joke every time. So we were curious. Everybody was curious. The kitchen staff had a betting pool on whether the human delegation would eat with their hands. I'm not proud of that. I put in 2 marks. 9 days before. The delegations arrived across the week, and by the 9th day before the recognition, the Skyhold was fuller than I'd ever seen it. 11,000 guests, 1,400 staff. The lower galleries smelled like 6 different atmospheres bleeding through 6 different filtration seals. I was on tray duty in the East Ascension, which meant I spent 11 hours a day carrying warm cups up 9 flights of stairs to delegations who'd asked for warm cups and then forgotten they'd asked. That's where I first saw her. She was sitting on the 12th step of the 9th flight, which is a stupid place to sit, and she had her boots off. I stopped. I remember stopping, and I remember the tray tilting, and I remember catching it against my chest and burning the inside of my wrist. She looked up. She was small, even for a human, I later learned. Dark brown skin, black hair cut close, and a scar through her left eyebrow that split it into 2 pieces. She was maybe 24 in their years, and she was rubbing her own foot with both thumbs like it had personally offended her. Sorry, she said, in trade Kaleri, terrible trade Kaleri. The accent was like listening to someone chew rocks, but she said it. I'll move. These stairs are a war crime. I didn't know what to say, so I said, they are 9 flights. I counted. She pulled her boot back on, and she winced doing it, and she stood up. She came up to about my sternum. Every one. I have a very personal relationship with all 99 of them now. And then she took 2 cups off my tray. Just took them, balanced them, and started walking up beside me. You don't have to do that, I said. You've got a full tray, and a face like you've been doing this since the sun came up. I have. Yeah, she adjusted her grip, so. We walked up 4 more flights. She didn't talk much. At the top, she put the cups back on the tray, gave me a nod, and went off down the corridor toward the guest wing without asking my name or telling me hers. I stood there for a while. I want to be clear about something. This was not a moment. I didn't feel destiny brush past me. I felt confused and my wrist hurt, and I thought, that was a weird thing to do. It's only later that you get to call things beginnings. Her name was Marisol Ademi Ruiz. I learned that 3 days later from the head of household staff, a woman named Presteva Alo, who ran the Skyhold's interior the way a surgeon runs a table. Presteva had a list. She always had a list. She stood in the staff refectory with it and read out the delegation manifests so we'd know who we were serving and what we absolutely could not do around them. Human delegation, she said. 12 members, Ambassador Chenakari, Deputy Ambassador Tang, Cultural Attaché Pharaoh. She went down the list. Security element of 4, Lieutenant Ademi Ruiz commanding. Someone said, "Which one's the small dark one who's been carrying trays?" Presteva looked up. Her second eyelid did the slow flick it did when she was about to be unkind. "Someone's been carrying trays." The refectory got quiet. "That's the security lieutenant," she said. "Ademi Ruiz. And if the human ambassador finds out that a member of his armed escort is carrying dishes because our staff are too slow to do it themselves, I will find out who let it happen, and I will assign them to the drain galleries for the duration." I did not say anything. I was very interested in my bowl. "Also," Presteva said, and something in her voice shifted, "leave her alone, not for her sake, for yours." Somebody laughed. Presteva did not laugh. "She's a soldier," Presteva said, "of a species we don't understand, and she is bored, and bored soldiers make bad decisions. Don't be a bad decision." What she was actually doing. I'm going to skip ahead a little and tell you what I found out much later, because it explains everything, and I'd rather you understand it now than be confused for 6,000 words. Marisol Ademi Ruiz was not bored. Marisol Ademi Ruiz was on the 9th flight of the East Ascension, because the East Ascension was the only route between the guest wing and the Blue Hall that didn't pass a monitoring node, and she had spent 3 days working that out from a public architectural survey and a lot of walking. She wasn't planning anything. She told me this later, and I believe her, and I've had a long time to think about whether I should. She was doing what she called baseline. She was learning the building. Every route, every choke point, every place where a person could be cornered and every place a person could not. She did it in every building she entered. It was compulsive. She said she'd done it in restaurants. She said she'd done it in hospitals while visiting her own mother and had hated herself for it and done it anyway. "It's not paranoia," she told me once. "Paranoia is thinking something's coming. This is just knowing where the doors are. There's a difference." I said I didn't see the difference. She said, "The difference is that I sleep fine." The princess. I should tell you about Ilvin before I tell you about the Blue Hall. She was 7. She was small even for 7, and she had her mother's coloring, that pale slate gray that the northern houses have, and she had a bad lung. That's not a secret. Everyone knew. It was a birth complication, one of the ones that the healers can manage but not fix, and it meant that Ilvain, heir to the Aurelian chair and last of a 1,000-year line, could not run more than about 30 meters without going down on one knee. She was guarded like a state treasure and treated like glass, and she was, and I say this with real affection, an absolute menace. I'd see her sometimes in the lower corridors. She'd have slipped her attendants, which she could do, because her attendants were terrified of hurting her, and she was 7 and had no such fear. And she'd be sitting on some cold step somewhere with her chin on her fists, watching people work. She asked me once what I was carrying. I said warm cups. She asked me why they were called warm cups. I said because they held warm things. She thought about this for a while, and then she said, "That's a stupid name," and I said, "Yes, Highness," and she laughed. She had a good laugh, loud for her size. It always ended in a cough. That was the thing about her. Everything ended in a cough. And every time it did, you'd see 3 attendants flinch, and you'd see whatever she'd been doing, running, laughing, arguing, being 7, get quietly folded up and put away. I think she was the loneliest person in the Skyhold, and I say that as a man who spent 14 years standing against walls. 3 days before the incident, I wasn't there. I have to say that up front, because I've heard versions of this story where I was there and where I did something heroic, and they're a lie and I don't want them repeated. Here's what happened, as reconstructed by the Household Inquiry, which I read 6 years later when it was declassified and I was drunk and had access I shouldn't have had. 3 days before the recognition, Princess Ilvin slipped her attendance again. She went down to the cold gallery, which is a long, unheated corridor on the north face with windows that run floor to ceiling. It's the best view in the Skyhold. You can see the whole northern range from there, and on a clear day you can see the Tellys Glacier throwing light off itself 40 kilometers out. The windows are old. That's the important part. They're original from the Second Dynasty, and they've been reinforced 11 times, and there was a maintenance flag on panel 19 that had been sitting in the works queue for 4 months because the recognition preparations had eaten every available crew. Ylvain went to the window. She put her hands on it. Panel 19 let go. It didn't shatter. That's the horror of it. It didn't shatter, it bowed, the whole 2-meter panel flexed outward like a held breath, and it did it slowly, over about 4 seconds, because that's how those old laminates fail. 4 seconds, and a 7-year-old with a bad lung standing with both hands flat against it, 600 meters above a rock face. There were 2 people in the cold gallery. One was a Kaleri attendant named Yorick's son, who was 19 and had been in the job for 5 weeks. The other was Marisol Ademi Ruiz, who was there because the cold gallery was on her map and she was walking it. Yorick's son's testimony verbatim: "I did not move. I want to be honest in this record. I did not move. I saw it happen and my body would not go toward it." I've read that line probably 100 times. I don't judge him. I've asked myself seriously what I would have done, and I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know. Everything in a Kaleri body screams away from a drop. It's older than culture. It's in the spine. Marisol crossed 9 meters in under 2 seconds. She hit the princess at the waist. She didn't grab her, she hit her, shoulder into the child's midsection, and she carried her backward and down, and they went across the floor together. And Marisol took the impact on her hip and her elbow and the back of her skull. The panel went out, the whole thing. It fell 600 meters and came apart on the rocks, and the wind came in like a hand. She'd already rolled. She had the princess under her, face down, both arms over the child's head, and she was up against the base of the wall out of the wind line. And she was, Yorick said this, and it's the detail that gets me, she was talking. He couldn't hear what, the wind was too loud. But she was talking to her the whole time. After the cold gallery, they took Ylvain to the healers. 2 cracked ribs from the impact, a torn breath sac lining, a badly bruised shoulder. She was in a recovery cradle for 2 days. Marisol had a fractured hip, 3 broken fingers on the left hand, and a concussion. She refused a cradle. She said human medicine handled it differently. This was, I'm told, a lie, and she just didn't want to be unconscious in a building she didn't trust. The household inquiry took 4 hours. It was not gentle. The Kaleri legal position on physical contact with the royal person is old, and it is unambiguous. It is a capital matter. It has been a capital matter for 900 years. There are 3 recognized exemptions, and none of them is a foreign soldier tackled her. I know a man who was on the outer cordon of that inquiry. He said the ambassador, Chen Akari, the human, went white and stayed white the entire time. He said the human deputy tried to invoke diplomatic protection and was told courteously that diplomatic protection did not extend to the royal person. He said Marisol sat there with her hand splinted in her lap and answered every question in her terrible trade Kaleri, and did not once ask for a translator, and did not once look at her own ambassador. They asked her why she did it. He said she looked genuinely confused, like the question was in a language she didn't have. He said she was going to fall. And the warden of the chair said, "You understand that you may be executed for this." And she said, "And I have this from 3 sources now, so I'm confident," she said. Yeah, I understood that at the time too. The 2 days. Nobody knew what was going to happen. The Skyhold went strange. You could feel it in the corridors. 11,000 guests, and half of them had heard some version of the story by the second evening, and the versions were getting worse. A human had assaulted the air. A human had saved the air. A human had been executed already. A human had been given a title. The kitchen staff stopped betting. That's how you know it was bad. When Kaleari servants stop making jokes, something has gone properly wrong. I saw her once during those 2 days. She was in the lower refectory, which she was not supposed to be in, sitting alone at the end of a bench with a bowl she wasn't eating from. Her left hand was splinted. There was a healing strip along her jaw. She was staring at the wall. I should have kept walking. I put a warm cup down in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. She had this way of looking at you where you could tell she was checking something, where your hands were, where the door was, how long you'd been standing there. Then she recognized me, and it dropped off her face. "Stairs guy," she said. "Toma." "Marisol," she looked at the cup. "What is it?" "Warm." She laughed. It hurt her. I saw it hit her ribs. "Sure." I stood there. I didn't know what I was doing. "Is the girl okay?" she said. Not a question exactly, flat. "They say she'll recover." Yeah, that's what they said to me, but they said it in the voice you use when you're being careful. She turned the cup on the table with 2 fingers. "I need to know if I broke her ribs or if the window broke her ribs." I said, "You broke her ribs." She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting it and had wanted it confirmed anyway. "Okay," she said. "She would be at the bottom of the north face," I said. It came out sharper than I meant. There would be nothing to break. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "That's the math. I know that's the math. I did that math in about a quarter of a second and I'd do it again." She rubbed her eye with the heel of her good hand. "It's just that when I close my eyes I hear the ribs, not the math." She drank the warm cup. She said, "This is terrible." I said, "Yes." She drank the rest of it anyway. The Blue Hall. The recognition went ahead. Of course it did. You don't cancel a recognition. 11,000 guests and 400 years of protocol, and a court that would rather die than admit a crisis. The Blue Hall is not blue. Nobody knows why it's called that. It's a great vault of pale stone, 300 meters end to end, with the resonance lattice running visible up the columns in veins of dull silver, and it hums. And when 11,000 people are in it, the hum turns into something you feel in your teeth. I was on the west wall, tray of ceremonial ewers, standing furniture. The queen was on the Aurelian chair, which is not a chair, it's a slab, and she sat on it the way she sat on everything, like she was holding it down. Solving the second. I'd served in her house for 14 years and I had never once heard her raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had a stillness that was worse than shouting. When she looked at you, you had the distinct sense of being filed. Princess Ilvain was beside her, upright, in a cradle harness under her robes that you could see the shape of if you knew to look, face like carved stone. She was 7 and she was doing the thing that royal children learn to do, which is not be a person in public. The presentations went for 6 hours. 6 hours, species after species. The Threshkin delegation with their standing tanks, the Vec with their 16 banners, the Orlomer singing their formal greeting in that 6-part harmony that makes your eyes water. It's beautiful. It's genuinely beautiful. It is also 6 hours. And every delegation made the ritual petition for companion standing. And every time, the warden of the chair intoned the ritual decline. The Aurelian chair is honored. The Aurelian chair is complete. Over and over, 41 times. The humans were 42nd. The petition. They came up the long floor, and I watched the whole hall watch them. 12 of them. Ambassador Chenakari in the middle, an old man, silver-haired, walking carefully. The deputy, the attaché, and behind them the security element, 3 humans in dress uniform. And Marisol, walking with a cane. She should not have been there. Everyone knew she should not have been there. She was in a splint and a cane, and she was walking with the delegation into the Blue Hall, and I watched 11,000 people take a breath at the same time. I found out later this had been a fight, a very ugly fight, inside the human delegation that had gone on most of the previous night. Chenakari had ordered her to stay in quarters. She had, apparently, pointed out that she was the commanding officer of the security element, and that leaving the ambassador unescorted in a hostile building was a dereliction, and that if he wanted to relieve her of command he could do it in writing, right now, and she'd wait. He didn't do it. They stopped at the foot of the chair. They made the obeisance. Humans do a thing with the hands, it's not our obeisance, but they'd learned an approximation and they did it carefully, and I remember thinking that they'd practiced. Chenakari made the presentation, formal, correct. His trade Kaleri was better than hers. And then he made the petition. He had to, that's the thing, it's ritual, he had to. The delegation of humanity, he said, petitions the Aurelian chair for companion standing. And the whole hall went dead silent, because everybody in that room knew what had happened in the cold gallery, and everybody in that room knew that the ritual decline was coming, and everybody in that room understood that it was going to land like a slap. The warden of the chair stepped forward. He drew breath. The queen raised one finger. The water. The warden stopped. He stopped mid-breath and he turned and he looked at her, and I will never forget this, I saw the warden of the chair, a man who had held that post for 30 years, look frightened. The queen stood. She did not stand at recognitions. She sat on the chair for 6 hours and she received and she did not stand. It's not that it's forbidden, it's that it's not done. She stood and she came down the 3 steps, and she walked out onto the floor of the Blue Hall, and 11,000 people made no sound at all. She stopped in front of Chenakari. He was a head shorter than her. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked past him. She walked past the deputy, past the attaché. She walked down the line of the human delegation, and she stopped in front of Marisol Adami Ruiz. And Marisol, I was 6 meters away, I could see her face. Marisol went very, very still. Not afraid, still. Ready, still. I saw her weight shift onto her good leg, and I saw her free hand open at her side, and I thought, with a lurch of pure horror, she thinks she's about to be killed and she is deciding whether to let it happen. The queen looked down at her. The queen said, in trade Kaleri, clearly enough for the whole hall to hear, "You have a broken hand." Marisol said, "Yes, ma'am." "You did not accept the cradle." "No, ma'am." "Why?" And Marisol, and I don't know where she found it, I have never known, Marisol said. "Because I wanted to be awake, ma'am." The queen was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Why?" And Marisol said, "Because I didn't know what you were going to do, and I wanted to see it coming." The Blue Hall did not breathe. The queen turned. She walked back toward the chair. She stopped halfway at the little dais where the ceremonial ewers stood, 3 of them on a plinth, the water of the Aurelian spring, which is poured at coronations and at funerals and at nothing else. She lifted one. I heard the warden say, "Majesty." She carried it back down the floor. And she stopped in front of Marisol Adami Ruiz, and she poured the water of the Aurelian spring over the human's broken hand. The court was stunned. I want to explain what that meant, because if you're not Kaleri, it looks like a woman pouring water on somebody. The spring water is poured on the royal dead. That's it. That's the whole liturgy. It's poured on the hands of the dead of House Vinalitra before they're carried out, because the hands are what held the chair, and the water releases them from it. It had been poured 206 times in 11 weeks during the gray season, and the queen had poured most of them herself. Nobody living outside the house had ever been touched by it. The water ran off Marisol's splint and across the floor of the Blue Hall, and the resonance lattice hummed in the columns, and 11,000 people simply stopped. Then it started. It was not a gasp. Everybody says it was a gasp. It wasn't. It was worse. It was a noise, a low broken swell of noise from 11,000 throats, and there were people shouting, and there was a Vec banner going down because whoever was holding it had let go, and I heard, very clearly from somewhere behind me, an old Kaleri voice saying no, 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 no over and over like a prayer. The warden of the chair had gone down on one knee, not in reverence. His legs had stopped working. And the queen, with the empty ewer in her hand, with the water running out across the stone in a long, shining fan, the queen turned to face her court. And she said, "The Aurelian chair is honored." Pause. The Aurelian chair is not complete. What she said. I'm going to give you her speech as best I can. It was recorded, obviously, but the recording was sealed for 11 years, and I heard it before I read it, and I trust my ears. She said, "For 900 years we have declined this petition. We have declined it because to accept it is to say, there is something we do not have. We are a proud house. It has been easier to say we are complete." She let that sit. 3 days ago my daughter put her hands on a window that we did not repair. It was on a list. We knew. It was on a list, and the list was long because we were preparing for this room. Nobody moved. 4 seconds, she said. The glass took 4 seconds to fail. In those 4 seconds there were 2 people in the cold gallery. One was Kaleri, one was not. She looked out over them. The Kaleri did not move. And then she said the thing that got repeated across the whole Concord for the next 30 years. He did not move because he is sensible. Because in 4 seconds a sensible person calculates, and the calculation says, you will not reach her and you will go over with her and there will be 2 dead instead of 1. That calculation is correct. I have run it myself since. I have run it every night since. It is correct. She turned, she looked at Marisol. This one did not run it. Marisol said nothing. Water was still dripping off her splint. I have asked, the queen said, whether she is brave. I am told that this is the wrong question. I am told that among her people this is not considered remarkable. I am told that they have a word for what she did, and the word is not heroism, the word is. And she said it in the human tongue badly, and I remember the shape of it, reflex. She let the hall sit with that. We are 11,000 years in space, she said. We are careful. We are correct. And there is a thing in the bones of this small woman that we have engineered out of ourselves. And 3 days ago it was the only thing between my daughter and 600 meters of empty air. She set the ewer down on the floor, carefully, like it was heavy. My daughter is 7 years old, she said. And she has 1 lung that works, and she has no father and no brothers and no sisters and no cousins, and she is guarded by 400 people who are all sensible. Her voice did not break. I want to be very clear about that. Her voice did not break, not once, and that was somehow so much worse. I will not have her raised by the sensible, said Solving the Second. I have tried it, I have watched it, it is a slow falling. She turned back to the human delegation. The Aurelian chair accepts the petition of humanity, she said. Lieutenant Adami Ruiz will remain. What happened next? It didn't go smoothly. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story that gets told is very clean and very moving, and it leaves out the part where the Skyhold nearly tore itself apart for 8 months. The warden of the chair resigned. Publicly. He gave a speech about the sanctity of the water, and he went home to his estates, and he did not come back, and I don't think he was wrong exactly. 6 of the great houses filed formal objection. 2 of them threatened to withdraw from the succession council. The Threshkin ambassador, the one who'd made the joke about following danger home, gave an interview where he said the Kaleri had lost their minds, and then 11 years later gave another interview where he said it was the single most clear-sighted act of statecraft he'd witnessed in his career, and that he'd been wrong, and that he'd been wrong loudly, and he wanted that on the record. The human government had no idea what to do. Genuinely. There's a leaked cable from that week, it's public now, where the Human Foreign Ministry sent a message to Chenakiri that said, and I'm quoting, "Please clarify, has our lieutenant been arrested or adopted?" Marisol stayed for 9 years. 9 years. I'm not going to give you all 9 years. You'd be here a long time and I'd get some of it wrong. But I'll give you the parts I saw. I saw her teach Ilvin to fall. That's the first thing. Before anything else. 3 weeks after the Blue Hall, when the princess was out of the cradle and everyone was still treating her like she was made of ash, I came around a corner in the lower gymnasium and there was Marisol Adami Ruiz, still on a cane, standing over the heir to the Aurelian chair, who was flat on a mat. I nearly dropped the tray. Again, I have a real problem with trays. Ilvin got up. She was furious. She was 7 and she was scarlet with rage, and she said something extremely rude, and Marisol said in her terrible trade Kaliri, "Yeah, again." And the princess did it again. She fell about 40 times that afternoon. I asked Marisol about it much later when we were something like friends. I asked her why falling, why that first. She said, because everybody was telling her she'd break, and you can't argue a kid out of a thing like that. You have to show her. She said, so I showed her she wouldn't break, 40 times, and then she stopped believing them. I saw her fight the healers. Constantly, viciously. It was the ugliest ongoing conflict in the Skyhold, and it went on for years. The Kaliri position on Ilvin's lung was, protect it, minimize demand, keep her still. Marisol's position was that the princess had one working lung and a body, and that the body was being allowed to rot around the lung, and that in about 15 years there'd be a woman with one functioning lung and the musculature of a corpse, and everyone would call it the disease. She was not polite about this. She was not diplomatic. She was a foreign soldier arguing with the senior medical staff of an 11,000-year-old civilization, in bad trade Kaliri, about the lung of a princess she had personally cracked the ribs of. The healers hated her. She started small, walking, then walking further, then swimming, which nearly caused a constitutional crisis because Kaliri don't swim, and the very idea of putting the air in water. Ilvin could swim 400 meters by the time she was 12. 400 meters, with one lung, in a species that thinks water is where you go to die. I saw the bad night. There was a bad night. I've never told anybody about the bad night, and I'm only telling you because everyone involved is dead now except me. Ilvin was 11. She'd had a collapse, a real one, the lung folding, the kind that kills, and she was in a cradle for 6 days, and for 4 of those days the healers would not say she'd live. The queen sat with her, of course she did. But on the 3rd night the queen was called away, because a queen is always called away, and I was on the corridor, and I saw Marisol Adami Ruiz go into that room, and I saw her not come out. I stood on that corridor for 11 hours. It was my post. I did not leave my post. Around the 4th hour I heard, through the door very faintly, a human voice, singing. I don't know what the song was. It was in a human language, and it was not a good voice, and it went on for a long time. Around the 9th hour it stopped. The queen came back at dawn. She stopped at the door. She listened. Then she looked at me, she saw me, which she had never done in 14 years. I was furniture, I was a wall, and she said, "How long has she been in there?" I said, 9 hours, Majesty. The queen looked at the door for a while. Then she said, "Do not record it." And she went in. The ending. Ilvin Vinalitra took the Aurelian chair at 19, when her mother died of a stroke in the middle of a budget session, still holding a stylus. The coronation was the largest in Kaliri history, 14,000 guests, every species in the conquered. The water of the Aurelian spring was poured on her hands by the warden of the chair, as it has been for 900 years. And then, and this was not in the liturgy, this was not in anything, This had been argued about for 4 months by people who thought they were arguing about protocol. The new queen turned, and she took a second ewer from the plinth, and she poured it on the hands of a 41-year-old human woman with a scarred eyebrow and a permanent limp who was standing at the foot of the steps in a dress uniform that didn't fit her anymore. And the court, the court that had been rebuilt around this, the court that had spent 9 years learning what it meant. The court did not gasp. The court stood up. 14,000 people, on their feet, and the resonance lattice picked it up and turned it into a note you could feel in your sternum, and it went on for 4 minutes. Marisol Adami Ruiz stood there with the water running off her hands, and she did not know what to do with her face. She kept trying to fix it. She couldn't. She went home 8 months later. Her mother was ill. She said she'd come back. She didn't come back. Human bodies are strong and they are not long, and 41 is not old for them, but the hip never healed right, and something in her heart had been running hot for a very long time. Queen Ilvin heard on a Tuesday. She was in a trade session. She finished the session. Then she went down to the cold gallery, alone, and she stood in front of panel 19, which had been replaced and reinforced, and which had a small mark cut into the base of it that nobody had ever ordered and nobody had ever removed, and she put both her hands flat against the glass. And she stood there for a long time. I'm an old man now. I tell this story in a room above a repair shop in the lowlands, and people buy me drinks, and I've stopped being embarrassed about that. They always ask the same question at the end. Every time, somebody always asks it. Why did the Queen do it? Really, what was the political calculation? And I always tell them the truth, which is that I don't think there was one. I think a woman who had buried 206 people watched a stranger cross 9 meters in 2 seconds for a child who wasn't hers. And I think something in her that had been closed for 9 years came open. And I think she poured the water because she could not think of anything else in the whole of Kaliri civilization that would mean enough. I think she was saying, I have nothing that is worth this, so take the thing we use for the dead. It's the heaviest thing we have. That's what I think. But I was 6 meters away, and I was carrying a tray, and I was furniture. So what do I know? Here's what I know. I know that in 11,000 years of being careful, we built ships that outlast stars and laws that outlast dynasties, and a stillness so perfect that a 19-year-old boy could watch a child go out a window and find that his legs would not carry him. And I know that a small, tired woman with a bad accent came up 9 flights of stairs carrying a stranger's cups and looked at 4 seconds of empty air and did not do the math. We are the older species. We were in space when they were in caves. But when the glass gave way, it was not one of us who moved. And I have thought about that every day for 51 years, and I still do not know whether it is a story about them. I think it might be a story about us.